Hi, everybody. It's Monday night. This is the In Depth Show, Joe Firestone. Tonight I'm here for new macro media. Thank you very much for coming. I'll check in with Facebook now, see what's going on. For some reason, a huge amount of my resources are being used. I have no idea why. It's quite abnormal. Okay, can everybody hear me okay? How are the visuals? Hi, Greg. Hi, Kathy. Hi, Jimmy. Hi, Lana. Hi, Robin Halsey. Cara Emanuel. Dolores Pierce. Thank you all for coming. Very nice to see you here tonight. I hope my sound is okay. I lowered it a little to try to get rid of the echo. Hey, where am I, Dr. Joe? I'm in Ashburn, Virginia, in my usual place, in my combination study, dining room, and God knows what else. Lana says she's going to start a watch party. Thank you, Lana. And some new comments. Oh, my daughter Devora has joined. Greg says the audio and visuals are coming in well. Thank you, Greg. And Devora says there are still echoes. I wish I could debug the echo problem. One of my problems here is I've got so many different sources of sounds that I can never seem to get all of them. Robin says, "Hi, Joe. I've invited a former classmate. He's a libertarian. I'm working on him." Laugh out loud. Well, maybe you should start with Aristotle. Well, maybe he should start with Aristotle. Margot Shepard says, "Hi, Joe and everyone." Hi, Margot. Nice to see you. Uh, okay, so I'm going to start off now. The first article I'd like to deal with tonight relates to Bernie Sanders, and not just simply how Bernie is doing, but also to the larger question of how we are doing. How we are doing with Bernie having the problems that he's having. So let's sort of check in there and see where we're at. I picked up this article in Reader's Supported News. It's written by Norman Solomon, whose writing I really like. The name of the article is Bernie's Heart and Ours. And Norman takes off on the idea that the heart is not only a physical thing, it's also a metaphorical thing. And it relates uh, to some symbolic meanings of the word heart, as well as to the literal meanings of the word heart. So, you can see me there. That's good. I will try to bring this in a little more detail for you. First, I'll get rid of the extraneous matter. And there we go. That should make things a lot easier for you, right? So Norman says Bernie immediately used his heart trouble to advance a central mission. From the hospital, he tweeted, "I'm fortunate to have good health care and great doctors and nurses helping me to recover. None of us know when a medical emergency might affect us, and no one should fear going bankrupt if it occurs. And Medicare for all." That's what Bernie tweeted, unquote. Norman says that's the kind of being on message we so badly need. I have to fully disclose, okay, Norman is a part of Bernie's campaign and helps as an advisor. It's fully consistent with Bernie's campaign and his public life, quote, "not me, us," unquote. He's never been a glad hander or much of a showman. He's always been much more interested in ending people's pain than proclaiming that he feels it. I thought that was a very, very good way to put it. If you remember how Bill Clinton was always so into "I feel your pain." He was always good at telling people how he felt their pain. Trouble was, he wasn't much good, okay, at ending it. In fact, on balance, I think the legacy of his campaign, of his presidency, was to increase the pain that people feel rather than ending that pain. Anyway, Norman says here about 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to dialogue with Bernie during an, quote, "in conversation with," unquote, event in San Francisco, where several hundred people filled the room. Before we went on stage, there was a gathering in a makeshift green room that raised a small amount of money for his senatorial campaign coffers. Quote, "I've never been good at raising money," unquote, he told me. I thought about that comment when the news broke a few days ago that the Bernie 2020 campaign raised a whopping $25.3 million during the last quarter. You know about this, of course, with donations averaging just $18. But Bernie never went after money. It went after him from the grassroots, says Norman. I thought that was another very nice turn of the phrase. From the middle of this decade onward, as the popularity of Bernie and his political agenda has grown, so has the hostility from the corporate media. The actual Bernie campaign is in sharp contrast with cable TV coverage as well as the press narratives. The campaign looks set to fully resume soon. When Bernie left the hospital on Friday, NBC News quoted the chief of cardiology at the UC San Diego School of Medicine, whose name is Etisham Mahmoud, who said that the 3-day length of hospitalization indicates the senator, quote, "probably had a small heart attack," unquote, and, quote, "they require really a very short recovery time," unquote. So, from all indications, Bernie will soon be back on the campaign trail, once again hammering on grim realities that are evaded or excused by the political and media establishment, like the fact that just three individuals, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, and Bill Gates, have as much wealth as the bottom half of the entire population of the United States. So that was a few days ago. This article was written by Norman, and so since then, Bernie has rested up somewhat. But as I understand it, he was up and around a little today, so beginning to get back into the swing of things already after only a few days to rest up. Most people seem to agree that the two stents are likely to increase his already seemingly boundless energy. And I think the general opinion, and he's going to come back from this very, very strong. Last month, in an interview about his proposal to greatly increase taxes on the extremely rich, Bernie said, quote, "What we're trying to do is demand and implement a policy which significantly reduces income and wealth inequality in America by telling the wealthiest families in this country they cannot have so much wealth," unquote. Such concentrations of wealth and the political power that goes with it are antithetical to genuine democracy. And here I remind you of Bernie's very forthright statement billionaires should not exist. For his entire adult life, Bernie Sanders has been part of social movements intent on challenging such profit mad industries as corporate healthcare, financial services, mass incarceration, and the military industrial complex that cause so much opulence for the few and so much suffering for the many. The enormous inequalities of wealth and power are systemic and ruthless, with devastating effects on vast numbers of people. Norman says, that's where the heart, as a metaphor, is apt. Bernie has a huge and eternally healthy heart, filled with the lifeblood of empathy and dedication. In essence, that's what the Bernie 2020 campaign is all about. As he has been the first to say, it's not about him, it's about us. How much compassion and commitment can we find in our hearts? And I think that's a wonderful question for us to ask ourselves continuously. And if we find the compassion and the commitment there that I think we can and will find, then we should understand that that compassion and that particular commitment should bind us very, very strongly to Bernie's campaign and to what he is trying to do. It is a campaign of boundless compassion and boundless commitment from millions of people already. And it's a campaign whose compassion and commitment can only grow as the struggle for the Democratic Party and for U.S. democracy continues. So I'd like you to keep that in mind as we go on to the next of our topics for tonight. It's really part of the same topic, and it's about getting corporate money out of politics. Before we go through Bernie's latest plan to get corporate money out of politics, I'm going to go back to Facebook for a little to see what the story is with you. First, do I still have the echo, or have I managed to get rid of that? I hope I have. Robin says, I read that before. Karen Reese has joined. And Steve Wolfbrand says, Dr. Joe pops up when you least expect him. I thought you expected me at 9 o'clock nearly every night, Steve. And Randy Hedgerbeth has joined. And Elizabeth Bergen, Netherlands, has joined. Hi, Elizabeth. How are you? And Steve Wolfbrand says, you got to have heart, damn Yankees. I remember that. You got to have heart. You got to have heart. In fact, just a little personal story when it comes to the damn Yankees. My father had a small business, okay, in New York. It was a cleaning business. But one of the things he did is he handled the dry cleaning for the Broadway shows. Okay. After a while, he got some opportunities to invest in some of the Broadway shows when they were starting out to get in with a small investment. Maybe he could afford to put in maybe $500 or something like that. The first show he invested in was The Pajama Game, which was a pretty big hit actually back then and got made into a movie later. And then there was Damn Yankees also. That's why I brought this up. He was a small investor in Damn Yankees. And so, of course, for a while there, I knew every song from the show and every star and was completely into Damn Yankees. And later on, he invested in West Side Story, too. Those shows were fantastic. But anyway, a sad story followed that, which I'm not going to go into. But let us go on with your comments. So, Robin Halsey said, blanking in and out. Is it my ISP? I don't know. It could be the ISP, could be the cable. There are lots of different reasons why that could be a problem. Steve says that's when the smiling should start. Bonnie joined. Hi, honey. Sunday Dascalia joined. And Alan Scott has joined. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Steve says Bernie's good to go. And Elizabeth says CNN reported today he and Jane were out for a walk in Vermont today. I heard that too. They were up and about, as it were. Greg says we also need to close up the tax loopholes which allow shale companies to exist simply for the purpose for sending money to countries which serve as tax-free safe havens. Steve says, yep. Steve DeVore says, I've been flipping back and forth between this and Savage Joy. Thanks. Well, thanks for coming, Steve. Steve Wolfbrand says, if Bernie drops dead, God forbid the revolution doesn't stop. God forbid, Steve. I hope we have the compassion and the commitment to continue the revolution, even if Bernie, for reasons of health, has to drop out somewhere along the line. Steve says, yes, please. How do we get rid of corporate money? We'll go into that in a minute. Steve says, I still have a little echo. I'm not sure what I can do about it, but anyway, Steve Wolfbrandt asks, what's the Savage doing? Joyce never seemed like too much of a savage to me, I'm afraid. I got to say that. And Nicholas Miyagi Maslow has joined. And Cara Manuel says, my mom saw all those shows back then. Yeah, they were great shows. And Cara Manuel said, yeah, I read that already. Steve DeVore says, you're most welcome. DeVore Firestone says, if Bernie comes to October 15th debate at full strength, it will be hard to convince anyone that he's in peril. It will be hard to convince anyone. So we'll see how he does. I have a feeling he's going to come in at full strength, okay, into the debate. So let me go here, and before I start covering what Bernie had to say, I want to link to my special message page, commercial message page, unfortunately. Please share, like, and subscribe. Of course, share and like on Facebook, but share, like, and subscribe for the YouTube video that will get posted just after this one, but later on tonight. And my Patreon page, if you're so inclined, is www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. Now, back to the show, and specifically to Bernie Sanders' program to get corporate money out of politics, which I think is not entirely about getting corporate money out of politics, but we'll talk about that as we go through it. It says, of course, at first that Bernie will ban corporate contributions to the Democratic Party convention and all related committees, and that as president, he will update and strengthen. So, two elements here. As the Democratic nominee, he'll ban corporate contributions to the Democratic Party convention and all related committees right then and there. As the nominee, if he wins the nomination, no more corporate contributions. Keep that in mind. As president, update and strengthen the federal election campaign to return to a system of mandatory public funding for national party conventions. Hang on a second. One more thing I want to do to try to get rid of the echo. Let's see if this works. Okay, let me know, please, if the adjustment I made has made any difference in the echo. And let me make sure that my Facebook sound is set correctly. Looks like it's off there. So, okay, back onto it then. So, a little more on ending corruption of presidential inaugurations. I shouldn't say more. I should say detail on ending corruption, okay, of presidential inaugurations. So he says corporate donors spent tremendous amounts of money on inaugural events. In 2016, Trump's inaugural donors included AT&T, Bank of America, Boeing, ExxonMobil, General Motors, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and many more. And there was a similar list, okay, for Obama's inauguration, of course. Bernie points out private prisons also shelled out hundreds of thousands of dollars for Trump's inauguration. And this is nothing new. Corporate donors to 2013 inauguration included Microsoft, Boeing. Yeah, there it is. That's Obama's. Chevron, Genentech, and numerous federal contractors. Many of these corporations have federal contracts and business that comes before Congress. It is absolutely absurd that these entities are allowed to spend enormous sums of money in an attempt to garner favor with the President and Vice President of the United States. Yes, I couldn't agree more. And as President, Bernie will ban all corporate donations for inaugural events and cap individual donations to $500 and a limit on individual donations now. is, I believe, still $2,800. But I may be mixing up two different things. There may be a limit of $2,800 for election campaigns, but there may be no limit at all for individual donations. I don't really know. But capping individual donations to $500 here is a reform that's certainly very significant. Under public election reform, Bernie says over the years, the Supreme Court has made numerous decisions that increase the influence of money in politics. Yes, we noticed, Bernie. We noticed. We must overturn these disastrous decisions and ensure that Supreme Court justices are held to a high standard of honorable conduct in the future. In 2016, the fundraising committee for the DNC was led by an insurance executive and a Comcast executive. Yes. And then Comcast, of course, proceeded to pressure the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party to have the FCC vote to end net neutrality. And eventually, after all protests and all kinds of ruckus, that is exactly what happened. Ajit Pai, who some people think was always a Trump nominee, they forget he was a nominee of Obama to the FCC. Okay. Some committee chairs work as CEOs, says Bernie, and board members for large healthcare lobbying groups and companies such as Comcast. Under my administration, DNC will no longer accept corporate money. In addition to fixing how the national parties raise money, we need to stop the influence corporations have on individual candidates who are running for office. The FEC no longer acts like an enforcement agency. It needs to be replaced to effectively regulate campaign finance and to address the outside influence large corporate donors have on candidates. We must move to publicly fund federal elections in order to ensure a fair playing field free of the corrupting influence of large donors. Bernie says, as president, Bernie will fight to pass a constitutional amendment that makes clear that money is not speech and corporations are not people. By doing so, we will overturn the Supreme Court ruling that says money is speech, specifically Buckley versus Vallejo, that 1976 ruling by the Supreme Court. Which, by the way, was passed by a fairly liberal Supreme Court compared to what happened later. It was a controversial decision at the time. Next, it'll pass legislation to end super PACs, also political spending by 501c4s and other organizations who accept unlimited contributions or do not disclose their donors. And second bullet point, overturn Citizens United, which allows corporations to spend unlimited money on elections. Now, overturning citizens can happen in a number of ways. One thing that could happen is that some of the younger Supreme Court justices might happen to die off and be replaced by appointments, of Bernie's, changing the balance of the court so that they would overturn the CU in an entirely new case. The second way for this to happen okay, is to actually pass an amendment to the Constitution to have that happen. Now, that's probably going to take 7 years to get done. It may be if Bernie wins and Democrats take over the House and Senate, that it will be easy to pass the amendment through the Congress. But judging from the history of ratifications by the states, it's quite likely it's going to take a number of years to get that money out of the elections. And until that happens, okay, until that happens, those elections where corporations are spending unlimited money will continue to go on. The question is, can we afford to wait for a constitutional amendment to pass? Well, one alternative, so that we don't have to wait, is to expand, or more popularly known, to pack the Supreme Court. As many of you may know, the Supreme Court did not always have 9 justices. It had less justices at the beginning. During Andrew Jackson's time, it had 7 justices on the Supreme Court, but he did not like the decisions of the Supreme Court, so he got the Congress, which was favorable to him, to pass a law, which Congress is allowed to do, expanding the membership of the Supreme Court to 9. Okay, and ever since then, it's remained at the 9. But there's nothing constitutional about the 9. There's nothing sacred about it. So it would be easy if Bernie had control of both houses of Congress, and if the Congress people were willing, it would be relatively easy to pass a law which expanded the size of the Supreme Court to perhaps 11 justices or 13 justices or maybe 15 justices or maybe 17 justices. I don't know. A sufficient number of justices to swamp the current conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Of course, this would be very, very political, but no one can really deny that right now the Supreme Court is very, very political, and that the reason why the majority of 5-4 continues to exist is because of the political machinations of the Republican Party and Mitch McConnell in particular. In fact, the reason why that majority was established in the first place was probably due to the fact that a Republican Supreme Court during on the following the election of 2000 made certain decisions that had the effect of making George W. Bush the president of the United States instead of Al Gore. And then Bush had some appointments to the Supreme Court, of course, which otherwise would have gone to Gore. Okay. But you know that history. There was a lot of politics involved in producing the 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court that we have now, and in also creating a Supreme Court which has a distinct bias towards corporations and corporate interests. So I don't think it would be remiss for Bernie to pack the court. Now, I don't know if he's going to go that way. He hasn't promised that in any of his plans, but I think that's one way he could go. Now, a second way that he could go is he could use Article 3, Section 2, the authority of Congress, or Congress could do this, which is provided in Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution. Let us look at Article 3, Section 2 for just a moment. You notice in section 2, this is outlining the judicial power. Section 2, it says the Supreme Court shall have jurisdiction. Well, it says, in all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, and those in which a state shall be party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. I'm reading, of course, from the Constitution of the United States. In all the other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact. With such exceptions, and under such regulations as the Congress shall make. Now that last, with such exceptions, and under such regulations as the Congress shall make, is vital, because that is what is sometimes called the exceptions clause. It's the exceptions to the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. That is to say, the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So Congress controls the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court as a court of appeals. Now, a campaign finance law passed at the national level by Congress could, if the Congress was willing, contain an exceptions clause excluding the Supreme Court from having appellate jurisdiction over the law, prohibiting the Supreme Court from judicial review of the law. So prohibiting the Supreme Court from declaring the law unconstitutional. And for that matter, Congress could do the same with respect to any appellate court, not simply the Supreme Court. In other words, the jurisdiction of the Supreme Courts, the jurisdiction of the appeals courts, are under the regulation, under the authority of the Congress of the United States. Now, I don't know whether Congress has ever exercised the exceptions clause in any case, but it is there in the original Constitution, and the wording is clear. So Bernie can use the exceptions clause, or get Congress to use it, to pass new campaign finance laws that would regulate what corporations would do or what individuals would do in relation to spending money on elections. He could pass a law that also made clear that corporations are not persons under the Constitution, and that they are not entitled to the guarantees of the Bill of Rights that apply to individuals, that apply to biological persons. And such a law could also contain an exceptions clause, making it clear that the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction over appeals of that particular law, that law cannot be appealed to the Supreme Court. I have to say, I really don't care whether Bernie uses the first method or whether he uses the second method to bring the Supreme Court under control. But this Supreme Court is a runaway Supreme Court. It's destroying our democracy, and one or the other has to be done, it seems to me. I guess I should say I don't care. I would actually prefer the court packing, because in a way, that is a gentler sort, of remedy. Anyway, that's my view of this. I notice Bernie doesn't have any of this in here. But, of course, since he doesn't, it isn't clear how he would overturn CU. Next, Bernie says he would abolish the worthless FEC and replace it with the Federal Election Administration, a true law enforcement agency originally proposed by former Senators John McCain and Russ Feingold. The new FEA would have 3 members, a chair and 2 administrators. All members must have a background in some form of law or ethics enforcement, which would also include former judges. The hearing for violations of campaign finance laws would be conducted before an administrative law judge, and the FEA can impose civil and criminal penalties for violations. The members would have 6-year terms, and the chair would have a 10-year term to prevent any one future president from picking all 3 members. That might work. It certainly would help. I don't know whether it would be sufficient or how long it would work. If a future president could pick 2 of the 3 members, and those picks were political, which the 6-year terms allow, then that could still create a considerable amount of havoc in the FEA. Anyway, that's something to be considered. Next, Bernie says he would end the influence of corporations at the DNC. He would ban donations from federal corporations and also lobbyists. Institute a lifetime lobbying ban for National Party chairs and co-chairs. Well, there goes your retirement, Tom Perez. Ban chairs and co-chairs from working for entities with federal contracts that are seeking government approval for projects or mergers. Can reasonably expected to have business before Congress in the future. He also says he would pass mandatory public financing laws for all elections. And he says the FEC will determine the appropriate threshold candidates must meet in order to qualify for public financing. And he would establish a new system of universal small dollar vouchers that would give any voting age American the ability to donate, quote unquote, to federal candidates. Next, he considers presidential primary debates. He points out that the private media outlets charge outrageous sums of money to run ads during presidential primary debates. This year, CNN reportedly required a commitment of $300,000 before a sponsor could buy ad time. during the presidential debates, and 30 seconds of airtime, he said, can cost around $110,000. The private media outlets are making enormous sums of money during events that are meant to inform the public about their candidates. Furthermore, many of their advisors have vested interests in who is elected. He says this type of influence must end. So, do you remember when Bernie was talking during a debate, and he pointed out, he said, "Yeah, the pharmaceutical companies are going to run ads, right? Well, we're debating, while I'm advocating for Medicare for all and for negotiating drug prices with them through a single payer system. They're going to run ads against that. They're going to be part of the debate. Gratis CNN, who allowed them to buy airtime." So, this is what Bernie's going to do about that. What he's saying is he thinks the public has a right to be informed about their candidates without having to listen to rebuttals of some of the candidates by interests that buy time from the private media outlets. Of course, it's true the private media outlets don't own their licenses to broadcast. Those licenses to use the public air, those licenses are granted by the FCC, and they can be pulled by the FCC. So legislation specifying what the FCC will do about these debates should be able to regulate what the advertisements are going to be like. As president, Bernie will ban advertising during presidential primary debates. How about that? Next is congressional reform. The influence that lobbyists have extends beyond contributions to national political parties and individual candidates. In Congress, there's a revolving door that allows congressional staff to move between lobbying firms and Capitol Hill. Congress cannot represent their constituents, while special interest groups have the ability to influence decisions with corner offices and lucrative job offers. As president, Bernie will institute a lifetime lobbying ban for former members of Congress and senior staffers. So, that is some pretty tough stuff there. For the most part, it deals with corporations, but there's one provision that I spoke of earlier, which limits individual individual contributions as well. Okay, at least when it comes to inaugurations. No $1 million contributions to presidential inaugurations. Well, I think that's a pretty good plan. I've tried to point out some ways in which it would have to be implemented, but thus far, it's the most far-reaching plan we've seen from a candidate to get money out of corporate money out of the political system. I'm waiting to see what Elizabeth Warren will do next, because I expect that while continuing to say that she will take corporate contributions after the primaries. I'm wondering what she will promise when it comes to getting corporate money out of politics, while at the same time she admits that she's going to take the corporate money and the PAC money if she's lucky enough to win the primaries. I thought that ought to be pointed out here. So, I hope you like this treatment of getting corporate money out of politics and my ideas on that. I'm going to look in on you now at Facebook and see what's going on. I may fade out for just a minute here while I refresh the page. Okay. There we go. So, Steve DeVore says he's agreed on the Savage one. I've never really seen her be savage. She seems to be enjoying herself in the interviews too much. So Greg Mallard says that guillotines would help after Bernie is nominated. We need to sack Tom Perez. I think that's probably one of the first things that Bernie is going to do after the shenanigans of Paris. Steve DeVore says, I want to build one and leave it by the White House gate. DeVore says, sounds good here. Good. And Elizabeth says, I've not heard an echo at all. Great. I finally got rid of it. Steve DeVore says it's a bit better. Steve Wolfbrand says no echo. Elizabeth Bergen Netherlands says, what about PACs? That's a great amount of the big dollar donors. Yep. I'll explain later, honey. Okay, Bonnie's asking me what's all the stuff on my screen. Because I'm looking at Facebook. What happens is there's kind of an infinite echo when I look at the Facebook page in this way. I can stop it, but it really doesn't matter when I'm looking at the comments. So, Dr. Joe for MFIR should run. I'll tell you, if I were 10 years younger than I am now, I probably would have run for something. Probably this time, or maybe in 2018. Anyway, so Elizabeth says a good way to track donors, and she puts up a link to opensecrets.org. Yes, that is a very good way. Steve says Dr. Joe should run for president. Steve, there's not much difference in background actually, between myself, okay, and Bernie Sanders, are kind of cut from the same cloth. He comes from Brooklyn. I come from the Bronx. We both come uh, from families that are Jewish. We both were brought up in homes that placed a great emphasis on social justice. FDR was greatly loved. Okay, in my house. Uh, I studied when I went to school. I studied the New Deal, um, history, okay, assiduously. I loved reading about that time and the various things, okay, that FDR did. We don't know today or have a realization of how different FDR was than even Harry Truman in terms of his capacity, okay, for action and his capacity for trying this and trying that and trying to do other things. FDR was very, very hard to keep up with. And that may be one of the most signal characteristics, okay, of Bernie Sanders. He's restless to always make things better, always wants to make things better. So Greg says this should also be done on the state level as well. Not sure exactly what you're referring to, Greg, but sure you'll make it clear. Steve says the balls on Dr. Jones, okay, are huge. I think that's a thank you, Steve. Steve DeVore says cable companies should give all candidates a certain amount of free airtime. Yes, I think they should. I think the debate time should be free. Of course, the cable companies are not going to like that. It would cost them a fortune. So maybe what we need is a government cable company that will carry the debates. Maybe that would not be a bad idea. Something like the BBC, but here. Oh, I forgot. That's socialism. Oops. Margot Shepard should say, Margaret Shepard has joined, and Kathy Langan and two other people joined, and Randy Hedgebeth has joined again or rejoined, and Dolores Pierce has rejoined also. Greg says I was referring to the campaign finance reforms. I'll get Alec and the Koch funded. It'll get Alec and the Koch funded politicians out of office. Absolutely, absolutely, it would. Absolutely, it would. A very good point, Greg. A very good point. Let's hope that in the legislation itself, there's no limitation only to federal elections and federal campaigning. But that we might have to make it a constitutional amendment, but if we make it a constitutional amendment and we get that passed, then maybe we can get the Koch funded politicians out of office because we can get the Koch funding out of the process. Anyway, But going on, I did want to cover tonight also, okay, at least briefly, I did want to cover what's happening with the Extinction Rebellion because it's so important. So, an article appeared today in Common Dreams, October 7th. That's today. It's called Get on the Streets and Bring Everybody. Extinction Rebellion kicks off 2 weeks of global action. And the article was written by Jessica Corbett, who's one of the very good staff writers of Common Dreams. Nearly a year after Extinction Rebellion launched in London, the global movement that uses nonviolent civil disobedience to demand ambitious climate action kicked off 2 weeks of protests on Monday with demonstrations around the world that blocked the major roadways and led to arrests. Quote, starting on October 7th for 2 weeks, Extinction Rebellion is calling an international rebellion. Together, we will peacefully occupy the centers of power and shut them down until governments act on the climate and ecological emergency, unquote. The XR movement says on its website, quote, leave your desk, invite your boss, walk out of school, switch off the TV, put down your phone, get on the streets, and bring everybody, unquote. London is just one of 60 global cities where XR members held protests Monday on planning future actions for international rebellion, according to the movement's webpage that sorts upcoming protests by continent. Demonstrators worldwide turned out in droves Monday, that's today, and are set to continue engaging in peaceful civil disobedience in the coming days across Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Oceania. We're sorry. We don't want to disrupt you, your families, and your loved ones. But the inaction of our governments on the climate and ecological emergency is a death sentence. We're terrified, we're angry, and we have to act now. Join us in the streets. Hashtag international rebellion. And then there's a Twitter link. And then this was authored by the Extinction Rebellion at Extinction R, which is its Twitter handle. After the London Metropolitan Police on Saturday used a battering ram to raid an XR building in the city and seize items such as disability ramps that organizers had planned to use to make the movement's demonstrations, quote, accessible and safe for all, unquote, XR activists on Monday blocked traffic across the city's government district of Westminster. Reuters reported at least 135 people were arrested, according to the news agencies. Large crowds of protesters blocked some of Westminster's largest and busiest roads, bridges, and squares, carrying banners with slogans such as, quote, climate change denies our children a future unless we act now, unquote. Banging drums and chanting that took over the tourist hotspot of Trafalgar Square and marched down the mall, the broad tree-lined avenue that leads to Buckingham Palace. Some activists glued or chained themselves to cars parked in the middle of roads or to street lamps, making it hard for police officers to detain them. Quote, we're here because the government is not doing enough on the climate emergency, Lizzie Mansfield said to Reuters. Quote again, we only get one planet, and so we're here to try and defend it. The XR parked a hearse at Trafalgar Square to mourn mass species extinction, sent a message to the UK Parliament that truth demands action by hanging a banner on a barge in the River Thames. I'll click on that so we can see the banner hanging on the barge. Hopefully, where's the banner? Trafalgar Square to mourn mass species extinction. Sent a message to the UK Parliament. Truth demands action by hanging a banner on a barge in the River Thames. Sorry, can't see the banner hanging on the barge, but there's a lot of stuff on Wall Street. So back to the article. Quote, meanwhile, activists from Animal Rebellion, it's a movement allied to Extinction Rebellion, began marching from Russell Square to Smithfield Meat Market on Monday afternoon, reported the BBC News. And quote again, organizers said they plan to stage an overnight occupation of the market to share their, quote, vision of a future plant-based food system, unquote. Double unquote. From London, Berlin, uh, London, Berlin, and Madrid to Paris, Philadelphia, and Toronto, activists, reporters, and supporters shared updates from the streets on social media Monday with the hashtags hashtag International Rebellion, hashtag Everybody Now, and hashtag The Time is Now. Quote, in Berlin, around 1,000 people blocked the Grosses Stern, a traffic circle in the middle of the German capital's Tiergarten Park, dominated by the landmark Victory Column, according to the Associated Press. That protest began before dawn, unquote. Highlighting protests in other European cities, the Associated Press reported in Amsterdam, hundreds of demonstrators blocked a major road outside of the Rijksmuseum. I think it's the Rijksmuseum, one of the city's most popular tourist attractions, and set up tents. The protest went ahead despite a city ban on activists gathering on the road. The protesters ignored police calls for them to move to a nearby square. In Spain, a few dozen activists briefly chained themselves to each other and to an elevated road over a major artery in the Madrid area, snarling traffic during the morning rush hour. National police said 33 activists were taken to their premises, and 3 were arrested for resisting orders by anti-riot officers. 4 teenage girls were among the 30 people who were arrested in Sydney on Monday for attempting to stop vehicle traffic. XR organizers told The Guardian, according to the newspaper, hundreds of people joined a march and rally in Australia's capital city. Sisters 10-year-old Luca and 12-year-old 12-year old Maddie Brett Hall were among those who marched from Sydney's Belmar Park to the Central Business District. And Maddie said, quote, I feel like we need to make a difference. Ember Henninger, a 10-year-old who marched in Sydney on Monday, said that, quote, the government tells us to just be kids. And this makes me feel angry, unquote. XR's International Rebellion follows a global week of action bookended by a pair of climate strikes on September 20th and 27th, which were inspired by the school strikes launched by Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg and other youth climate activists worldwide. The hashtag climate strike actions coincided with the UN Climate Action Summit in New York City. As the results of the UN Summit highlight, we can no longer rely on governments to do what is needed in the face of climate and ecological breakdown. Extinction Rebellion, New York City spokesperson Trellin Smith said in a statement last month, quote again, "We have the right and the moral obligation to be on the streets telling the truth about this crisis and demanding responses from our government at this critical time." Unquote. One of the big reasons why, in my view, it would be good if we could impeach Trump as soon as we possibly can, okay, is because such an action might just result in these kinds of protests actually having some small measure of influence on our government and on our lawmakers. It will never have any influence on Donald Trump. We can forget about that. But there are so many things that might never have happened if Trump was not in office now. It may be Bolsonaro would never have been elected in Brazil. So the genocide being carried out there right now may never have occurred. The action just taken in Syria to give the Turks free reign in Syria to go after the Kurds would probably never have happened, okay, except for Trump, who probably made a deal, okay, with Erdogan to say that the United States, after receiving the backing of the Kurds and the help of the Kurds in fighting ISIS, Trump still made that deal, okay, with Erdogan to allow Turkish forces to now slaughter the Kurds with aircraft, okay, and with tanks through an upcoming invasion, okay, of Syria, which Turkey has no right to do, has no right to do anyway. So, things like that, things like that, things like the continued prosecution of the war, okay, in Yemen, things like the children in concentration camps at our borders, those kinds of things can happen with a president who is apparently impervious, totally impervious to public opinion. children in concentration camps at our border. Those are kinds of things. So, anyway, I want you to keep that in mind. That's one reason why a quick impeachment of Trump is important. Trump can do an awful lot of damage between now and 2021. We have to put maximum pressure on to get him out of office. If the Republicans should continue to resist, then that can only be to the Democrats of only be to the benefit of the Democrats when the election comes in 2020. I think the Republicans are going to be between a rock and a hard place on this. If we can pressure, but we've got to get Nancy Pelosi to pressure. We've got to get her off the dime. There is no better way than to throw money and support into the campaign of Shahid Buttar, who's running against her in her California congressional district. If I remember correctly, it's the California 10th, but I'm not entirely sure about that. So you can look it up easily for yourselves. Anyway, I'm going to check in on you now and see what comments you have. Greg says Georgia has a bunch of Koch-funded politicians in the state legislature. Yes, indeed, he has. Susan Eldridge has joined. Hey, Susan. I got your message. Haven't had a chance to follow it up, but I certainly will. And Greg Mallet says, overthrow the monarchy. And Greg says, protest outside of number 10. Yep. Let's keep number 10 blockaded. And Cara Emanuel says, hopefully the demonstrations in the U.S. won't stop if a Democrat wins in 2020. Trump has inspired many protests. Not just a Democrat. If we don't want those demonstrations to stop, it has to be Bernie in the White House. Because if I know Bernie, he's going to call the demonstrations. He's going to join the demonstrations. He needs the demonstrations. He needs the protests. Because if I know Bernie, he's going to call the demonstrations. He's going to join the demonstrations. And Steve says, protesting in America can get you a low-level terrorism charges placed against you nowadays. Just ask the water protectors. We're one step closer to a fascist America. How do we get around this? Well, I'm just going to come back to it. We have to elect a progressive Congress. We have to elect as many progressives as we can in the state. And we have to elect Bernie Sanders, because he will certainly do everything he can to restore our civil liberties in this country. And he will do everything he can to stop the lawlessness of the law enforcers. He will do that. He is serious about that. I know that. Sam says, bingo. That's scary as fuck. Susan Eldridge waves, and Greg Mallard says, Corbyn in, Tories out. Absolutely, Greg. Corbyn in and Tories out. I hope Corbyn hasn't overplayed his plan by trying to walk the fine lines over there that he's trying to walk. I think Corbyn uh, really needs to negotiate conditions which would allow him to retain ties to the common market, but completely divorce himself from the Eurozone, as long as they compromise the monetary sovereignty of their members. Sam's laughing because he made me say fuck. Oh, well. Well, I hate to give you some bad news, but actually, I very often say fuck, though I admit not often on the air. Greg Mallet says former UK PM Theresa May's husband, Philip May, made a massive profit from the security used at Standing Rock. Now that is what I call corruption. He made a massive profit from repressing the Indians in America. My God. That's incredible. The oligarchy is an international oligarchy. We know it's an international oligarchy. So, what do we need? We need to have an international democracy movement to overthrow the international oligarchy. Of course, to gain a real foothold, the international oligarchy movement has to be, anti-oligarchy movement, has to be powerful here in the United States. It has to be enormously powerful here. Well, any last comments? Sam says, wow, that is messed up. It is messed up. Really messed up. Steve says, I didn't know they were involved. No, I didn't know they were involved either. Okay, it's news to me, Steve. It's good news. I mean, to give us the news is good. I don't mean it's good news from the standpoint of spreading the good news. It's bad news, but it's good news to inform us with, for informing us of what we are up against. We're up against an international oligarchy, powerful across national lines. Greg says that's why we need to have Democratic Socialists and Progressives elected as president and prime ministers around the world. You're absolutely right, Greg. Absolutely right. And Steve DeVore says, understood. Okay, folks. And Greg says, look up G4S involvement in Standing Rock. Okay, Greg, thank you. Any other last comments before I say good night? By the way, I'll be back tomorrow with some other stimulating stuff. Cora says, and more Greens in Congress. You bet more Greens in Congress. And get those Greens educated about MMT. Two Greens we should have in Congress who are educated about MMT. We know very well. And maybe we will interview them again very soon, if we can. For example, Rodolfo Cortez Barragan is certainly one. And Kenneth Mejia is the other. I don't know if Ken is going to try to run again. He's run twice already and hasn't gotten very far against the establishment. But if he does run, if he can afford to run, then maybe this would be the year for Ken Mejia. I hope so. He's an MMT person. And Rodolfo Cortez is another MMT person. He'd be a really great representative. If we're looking for somebody with the Sanders heart, that's Rodolfo Cortez all the way. He's got that kind of heart. Okay, good night, everybody. It's 10:38. Hopefully, I'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you all for coming. Once again, don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. And don't forget my Patreon account. Thank you again.